Attention, battalion. Shoulder, arms.
By late September 1862, the first recruits began arriving for training in Brattleboro, Vermont. Camp Lincoln was the military training facility located on the grounds now occupied by the Brattleboro Union High School. It was here that they began their life in the Army. The vast majority of men had no military experience. In fact, for many, it would be the first time away from home. The first regiment to arrive at Camp Lincoln was the 12th Vermont, immediately followed by the 13th. Colonel Asa P. Blunt of St. Johnsbury assumed command of the 12th after serving with the 6th Vermont Regiment as lieutenant colonel. Living quarters were barracks 74 feet by 22 feet, designed to hold a company of 100 men.
Bunks were built about 4 by 6 feet, each calculated for 2 persons, just space enough between for one at a time to pass and climb over. No room to sit up, for would hit their heads on the bottom of the bunk above or the roof overhead. Likely, this was the first experience of many of the regiment sleeping on bare boards. Some found fault, others stoically submitted, thinking these might be palaces in comparison to what we must soon be contented with. Ralph Orson Sturdivant.
Ralph Orson Sturdivant, a 24-year-old native of Swanton, enlisted in the 13th Vermont, Company K. Sturdivant, a teacher, farmer, and painter by trade, later wrote the history of the 13th Vermont Regiment. Much of the events of the 9-month troops are seen through his eyes.
We were soon marched over to a long, low wooden building with stationary tables running through, benches for seats, and into these all pushed rapidly along, jostling each other, anxious for something, anything to eat, and soft bread, cold beef, and poor coffee was the meal.
Next came our final physical examination. It was held in empty barracks one cold afternoon. We were placed in single file around the walls, long enough for the surgeon to go through the whole company. And it wasn't any way comfortable, as there was no fire in the building, and it was like a barn. And all the clothing we had on could have been sent home in an envelope without extra postage. Henry Stevens Wiley.
Some of the boys trembled for fear they might yet be thrown out. This examination was critical and reminded me of the careful and scrutinizing examination of the horse buyer when about to purchase a valuable animal for market. We were required to go through various motions with hands, run and jump over a common empty flour barrel laid down on the floor. Cadmus S. Gates was not a good high jumper. His sprawling jump lighting on the barrel and his ride on it almost across the hall so amused the surgeons that they said, "You are all right."
Despite the discomforts of the new situation, some chose to see the bright side. Private George Grenville Benedict recalled immediately being placed on guard duty his first night in camp.
On the whole, it was quite a night for the first one in camp. I rather liked it. I flatter myself that it was a successful effort at guard duty. Not a rebel broke in, not a roving volunteer broke out over my share of the line. And if there was no sleeping, there was a good deal of other things. This was one of the finest opportunities to see the Connecticut Valley mist rise from the river and steal over the meadows, giving a shadowy veil to the trees. There was also the opportunity to see the morning break, not with a grand crash of bright surprise, but cushioned and shaded by a fog bank. Who will say that these are not compensations? And who wouldn't be a soldier? George Grenville Benedict, 12th Vermont Regiment.
As training continued, the recruits of the 12th and 13th Regiments were issued Springfield rifles, considered at the time to be one of the best in the Army.
The boys had to be told how to carry their guns, though most were quite familiar with the old shotguns that hung on the wall at home, with which as boys they had hunted and killed squirrels, skunks, woodchucks, etc. None, however, had had drill in the manual of arms, except a few who had served in the 1st Vermont Regiment. Springfield rifles were heavier and different, and had bayonets attached that were dangerous in the hands of a raw recruit. Occasionally, someone was accidentally pricked with a bayonet during our first drills.
Right oblique.
The next 2 weeks saw raw recruits transformed into fighting soldiers. Under the watchful eye of Colonel Francis Valteri Randall, the 13th Vermont spent many hours in drills, marching, and the practice of arms skills. Colonel Randall, an experienced officer, had served earlier with the 4th Vermont Regiment, and soon he earned the respect of the men of the 13th.
Colonel Randall, as he stood in front, looking from left to right, up and down the line, facing his boys for the first time, neatly dressed in new uniforms, taking in the living picture before him, was the most interested and proudest man of all. He responded to the salutation of the regiment with an uncovered head and wave of the hand, but said not a word, and as he turned to go, took from his pocket a handkerchief and wiped away the fast-falling tears.
Colonel Edwin H Stoughton, a graduate of the United States Military Academy, was camp commandant at the age of 24. He was promoted to colonel while serving with the 4th Vermont and participated in the Peninsula Campaign. Although a brave soldier, he did not earn the respect of the men as Randall had.
The orders were for a review of the regiment, fully equipped with knapsacks packed. About 15 minutes of waiting takes place before moving into line. In the course, your knapsack is evidently growing, both in size and weight. It felt heavy before. Now it weighs on you like 1,000 of brick. And now you are conscious of a sharp pain in the hollow of your arm from holding your musket at the shoulder for 3/4 of an hour. With all the need of drill and toughening for our work, 2 hours of knapsack drill on a hot afternoon was a pretty steep dose for raw recruits. George Benedict.
A man named Stoughton. His most striking characteristic was his senseless profanity and West Point snobbery. We have him to thank for the ever-memorable knapsack drill. How a man could inflict such a punishment on raw recruits, wholly unused to carrying such loads, is beyond my comprehension. If it was not for getting the men used to it, it was done with a vengeance. More like it was done to gratify one of his whims or show off his authority. Henry Stevens Wiley.
The camp continued to grow as 3 additional units arrived. The 14th Regiment, commanded by Colonel William Nichols, age 33, Nichols had been a lawyer in Rutland, was a member of the Vermont legislature, and initially served in the 1st Vermont. The 15th Regiment was commanded by Colonel Redfield Proctor of Cavendish, whose ancestors served with George Washington during the American Revolution. And finally, the 16th Regiment, commanded by Colonel Wheelock Vesey of Springfield. The camp had many visitors. Among them were doting mothers and loving brides who came to bid their loved ones farewell, and some came to marry before it was too late.
Sgt Edwin H Reid of Company E had become engaged to a young lady by the name of Miss Sarah Williams of Bakersfield before he enlisted. Miss Williams came, and they were married only 2 or 3 days before our departure for Washington. I knew them well, and cannot forget the scene at the depot as the young bride of a few happy hours was ruthlessly and suddenly separated from her loving husband. The parting was affectionate and very sad. Her brave young soldier boy husband she never saw again. He died at Camp Vermont, December 12, 1862.
In just under 4 weeks, nearly 5,000 new soldiers at Camp Lincoln trained and outfitted for war. The 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th Regiments soon left for Washington, D.C., and for 9 months of life-altering experiences.